Okay, friends, thank you so much for joining for this very important and timely and sensitive and rich topic from our tradition and in contemporary life, abortions and halacha. Note that the class is not called Abortions and Judaism. Halacha is one dimension within the broader framework of the breadth of Judaism, but specifically abortions and halacha. And there's a lot to talk about there, a lot of nuance and complexity. We really need a 10-part series. 1 hour of presentation and Q&A is hard to even scratch the surface, but we have a master teacher here calling in very late at night from Eretz Yisrael, from Medinat Yisrael, from the Holy Land, Rabbi Yoni Rosensweig, who is rabbi of the Netzach Menashe community in Beit Shemesh. You can go visit him next time you're in Beit Shemesh. He's the founder of the Magle Nefesh Center for Halacha and Mental Health. And he is a Ram in Midreshet Linenbaum and the author of several books. I got to know Rav Yoni many years ago when he was leading a yeshiva over there, and I got to partake in some of the learning with some of the students there. So Rabbi Rosensweig, thank you so much for being here and offering us this session today.
Thank you so much. And I always enjoy seeing Rav Shmuley and speaking with him, and in general participating in programs. So thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Before I go into the topic, let me just kind of like set our boundaries, set our framework, so to speak, in place. It's important, I guess, to realize, maybe more for me than it is for you, that the conversation in the US is very different than the conversation in Israel, mostly because there really is no conversation in Israel. In other words, there's a very significant Republican-Democrat divide, and this whole pro-life, pro-choice discussion, that exists, in the U.S. And I think it could get to, it becomes a heated debate and a charged debate with, very, very, I would say, strong feelings on all sides. It's not to say that you can't find people discussing this here in Israel, but it's not a public debate in the way that it exists in the US. It's certainly not a partisan debate, as if different parties discuss it and have different opinions about it in that way that from the US. So things are very different here. Even if I sound like an American, I made Aliyah when I was 1 month old. I grew up here my entire life. I was never part of such a conversation. And so I don't have an opinion one way or another in terms of the kinds of things, once again, that you're used to discussing over there. So I want to put that out there just for you to realize, if someone's trying to guess which side I'm on throughout this presentation, I'm not on any side specific, because like I said, I'm an American citizen, maybe technically, but I've never taken a side or discussed the issue from a political perspective or otherwise in America. So that's just putting that out there. Nevertheless, I understand and realize how sensitive some of these things can be. And I want to make it very clear, once again, that my goal throughout this presentation is, as Rav Shmuley mentioned, to talk about halacha and to try and present to you some of the wisdom that exists within the Gemara, the Talmud, and some of the commentaries that came after. And I'm more than happy for individuals in the audience to take issue with things that are said or disagree, and that's fine. I see myself more as a guide and a moderator of these sources, rather than an authority coming to tell you what to think or who to rule by. Okay, so that really is the goal. So if you feel like one of the sources doesn't necessarily jive with what you believe, that's fine. I'm not trying to convince you one way or another. My goal really is to just present mostly. And of course, if in the last 10, 15 minutes you really want to hear my opinion, I'm happy to try and go into that. But that's really not my goal today. I'm not trying to convince anyone of everything. I'm just trying to teach more than anything else. So that's point number 2. Point number 3 is that there is one thing that I can tell you that is agreed upon by every Orthodox authority that I'm aware of. And that is that human life is sacred, and not only human life, but also a child's life, and a child who is a fetus, their life is also sacred. And therefore, when we talk about abortions, it's not a simple topic. It doesn't mean that it's always a problem to do it or that it's prohibited, but it's not a simple issue, meaning what hangs in the balance is serious, all right? And we don't, even if we would say, and even when we'll see the sources that have to do with this, even if we would say that a fetus is not the same as a born human being, as a fully developed individual who breathes air and walks around, even if we were to say that there is a distinction, that does not mean that the fetus is, so to speak, not relevant in the halachic discussion. The fetus is definitely relevant one way or another. And aborting that fetus is something which is considered to be a monumental act of significant consequence, and therefore not taken lightly at all. Of course, when we look at the big picture, we think to ourselves, okay, that's not taken lightly, but what about the other side? Meaning, what about the result of having the child, of not aborting the fetus? Are those consequences taken lightly? And of course, they're not, right? So then the question becomes, of course, what happens when we pit one thing against another? What do we do in that situation? And any result that we come to is going to be difficult. There's no doubt about it. And that's why it's such a charged topic and such a charged debate. Because whether you are on one side or on the other side, the result is many times heartbreaking and many times difficult to deal with and to handle. And there's no easy answers with regards to this. So that's my third piece of introduction. And with that, with your permission, we'll go straight into the sources. And that's what I want to present to you first and foremost. I just want you to be aware of the sources. Now, I should mention one last piece of introduction. What is the definition of life? At the end of the day, to some extent, that's what we're trying to figure out. What is the definition of life? To be clear, this is not something that doctors, professionals, medical professionals are able to answer, meaning medical professionals are able to define different things for you. Meaning if you ask them, okay, when does the baby start breathing? When is there a heartbeat? When do they feel things? When it's that you can ask those questions. And of course, the person to ask is not me. I'm a rabbi, I'm not a medical professional. The person to ask is a doctor. But the question here is not when do certain things occur, but what do those things mean, right? So what is the meaning of the fact that there is a heartbeat? Does that make someone alive? What is the meaning of the fact that now he has arms and legs? Is that what makes someone? Is that what defines a person as living? What happens? Maybe they have to be born. Is that what defines? Right? The definition, the exact definition of life, is more one for philosophers and clergymen than it is for a medical professional. The medical professional is able, of course, to give you the facts, but what those facts mean seems to be a question that is more suited for those who deal with the humanities. Of course, those individuals, myself included, as a rabbi, don't have the answer, right? We don't know we can surmise what the answer is. We can offer a perspective on what the answer is, but that doesn't mean that we're right, and it certainly doesn't mean that we know everything. But like I said, the meaning of life, the meaning of the term life, is really something for theologians and philosophers. And that's what we'll see over here. We're going to see some of the, in a sense, the Jewish philosophical slash theological view that has to do with life. And it's inferred from certain sources in the Talmud and its commentaries. So that's what we're going to do, and that's how we're going to structure this. It's now 11:10. I'll speak for about 35 minutes, showing you some of the sources, after which I'm more than happy to take questions or comments. And I'm, of course, happy for everyone here to join in the debate and to give their 2 cents. I'm always happy to hear new things and to learn from everybody else. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to share my screen. if that's okay. And we'll take it from there. Sorry, one moment. Okay, now everything here is in Hebrew, but don't worry, I'm going to be translating everything as I go, just so that you can see. The first three sources that we have over here are the main sources that are used in order to discuss this issue. Okay, the first source in the Talmud is from Tractate Sanhedrin, and it says as follows. I'm going to read the Hebrew and translate as I go. Ashkach Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha dehavektiv besefer Agadat Debeirav. Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Acha, found something in a book. The book is called Agadat Debeirav. It features certain sayings in the name of another scholar from that time period named Rav. And it says as follows. Ben Noach neherag b'dayan echad u'be'ed echad shelo behatra'ah mipi ish v'lo mipi isha v'afilu karov. This entire line discusses the death penalty, which, as I'm sure you know, exists within the Torah, and that's not our topic today. We can talk about that some other time. But it discusses when and how such a penalty would be exacted upon what's called a Ben Noach. A Ben Noach is a Noachide, meaning someone who's not Jewish, son of Noah, right? As you know, we Jews are sons of Abraham, but Noachides are basically non-Jews. So in which situations would we say that non-Jews are liable for the death penalty? And when would they be liable? They would be liable if they, for example, committed murder. According to the Torah, if someone commits murder, then the punishment for that, the penalty for that, is death. So the Gemara here mentions several different considerations, several different criteria. And then it says, Mishum Rabbi Ishmael Amru Afalau Barin. This is the important part. So Rabbi Ishmael claims that even if one, God forbid, murders a fetus, ubarin are a fetus, even if one is to murder a fetus, that counts towards the death penalty. So in other words, the implication here is that a fetus is a person, right? Because once again, if I am obligated not to kill somebody else, if that is a prohibition, then I can't kill a person, right? But if, for example, I shot a bird out of the sky, right? So even if you're, definitely opposed to hunting birds, you still wouldn't say that it's the same thing as killing a human being. So the question is, when you kill a fetus, does that have the same status as killing a human being? And what Rabbi Ishmael is saying is, yes, it does. Afalo barin, if a Noachide kills a fetus, then that is the same as killing a human being. And then the Gemara continues to give a source for this. My ta'amei Rabbi Ishmael, the Gemara asks, what is the reasoning behind Rabbi Ishmael's words? And then it brings a verse from the parsha that we read on this last Shabbat. Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech, ezeu adam shu ba'adam haveomer, zeu bar shebimei imo. In other words, the pasuk, the verse, seems to include not just a person, but a person who's in a person. How do we have a person within a person? That obviously is a fetus. So therefore, we learn that, God forbid, the murder of a fetus is the same as the murder of a human being, and therefore one would be liable for the death penalty. Anyway, so what we see from this source seems very, very clear that there is a problem of killing a fetus, and there is no distinction being made over here between the age of the fetus. Okay, whether he's this amount of that age, this age, it does not seem to matter. However, in source 2, which is Tractate Nida, it says as follows: Tinok ben yomo haholgo chayav. There, it clearly states that if there's a child, even if the child is 1 day old, someone who kills that child is once again obligated to answer for his actions. And then the pasuk is brought, a verse is brought, tichtiv, ve'ish ki yakeh kol nefesh mikol makom, that any person that is killed, regardless of age, that one is, once again, chayav, obligated to answer for the act that they have caused. So this source seems to fly in the face of the previous one. To be clear, the previous source mentioned the killing of a fetus. This source mentions the killing of a baby who's 1 day old, implying that the baby does need to be at least 1 day old, meaning needs to be born. So if the baby is born and someone, God forbid, kills such a baby, then once again, they are held responsible for what they have done, and that is considered murder. However, if it's a fetus, it's implied from this source 2, that if it's a fetus, that there wouldn't be any consequences, at least not very severe consequences like the death penalty or anything of the sort. So these two sources, once again, source 1 and source 2, seem to contradict. Which brings us to source 3. Source 3 is a very interesting source. Tractate Sanhedrin again. And it says as follows. Amar Rav Huna, said Rav Huna, Katan ha'rodef nitan le'atzilo benafsho, kasavar rodef eno tzarich hatra'ah, lo shna gadol ve'lo shna katan. This section is talking about what's called a rodef. Perhaps you're familiar with the term. A rodef is someone who is running after you in order to kill you. Okay, what we would call killing someone in self-defense, right? So you're running away from someone, and someone is running after you, and in order to defend yourself, in self-defense, you commit murder, right? You kill that person. So we would say that's fine because it's self-defense. Such a person who's running after you to kill you, who's trying to kill you, you're allowed to save your own life, even if it means taking theirs. That's it may seem obvious to you, like it may seem morally or ethically obvious to you, but it's a big statement, right? It's a significant statement that it basically comes and says, while we believe that killing someone else is an abhorrent act, and one which we try to stay away from under every circumstance, nevertheless, if it's a rodef, if it's someone who's running after you to kill you, and the only way to stop him from doing so is to kill him, then you're allowed to do so. You're allowed to take a life in order to save your own. The Gemara says, and this is the section that is important for us, Eitive Rav Chisda le Rav Huna. Rav Chisda asked a question from Rav Huna, who said what he said before, Yatzar rosho ein nog'in bo, lefi she'ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh, ve'amai rodefu. And he answers, Shani hatam de mishmaya karad feila. Let me explain the question and the answer, and then we'll see why this source is so important. The halacha states that if a woman is in labor and she's giving birth, and suddenly, there are complications, and the doctors see that there's a choice to be made. It's either her or the baby. So here the halacha makes a distinction. If the baby is still a fetus, meaning he hasn't yet poked out, his head hasn't come out yet, in that situation, we save the mother. We save the mother. However, the moment that the child has begun to exit the womb, so the moment that his head, right, can be seen, at that moment he's considered a person alive, and we don't touch him. We're not allowed to kill him in order to save the mother. So long as he hasn't been born, we're allowed to save the mother by killing the fetus. But otherwise, we can't do so. So the Gemara asks, why not? Why can't we do so? Let's say the baby has poked his head out. Why can't we save the mother? He's a rodef, meaning we said that if someone's trying to kill you, that you're allowed to save your life, even if it means killing him. Why do we not, as the Gemara asks, why do we not refer to the child once he pokes out his head? Why do we not refer to him as a rodef and still save the mother? Why do we just let it be and see like what happens in a sense? And the Gemara, the Talmud responds that that's different. Shani hatam, that's different. Why is it different? Mishmaya karad feila. Because this is, in a sense, something that's happened mishmaya. Mishmaya means from the heavens. This is something that, in a sense, is out of our hands. The heavens are the rodef. In a sense, the way that the world works. This is a natural event. Some commentaries explain that there's a difference here because this rodef, meaning this little baby, does not want or is not trying, God forbid, to kill his mother who's giving birth to him. It is true that he is putting her life in danger, but it is unintentional, completely unintentional. And therefore, because of it, so it's a different kind of situation and is not comparable in any way to a regular situation where someone is actually running after someone else in order to kill him. So that it might be very, very different. Nevertheless, what do we see here in this very interesting passage? We see that when the mother's life is in danger, right? So if the baby has been born, they are equals from a halachic standpoint, meaning she and the baby are equals and we can't prefer one life to another. However, if the baby has not yet come out of the womb and he's still in the womb, then we clearly prefer the mother's life to the child's life. Does that not prove, on the face of it, it does, but does that not prove that the child's status as a living being is very different than the mother's status as a living being, because we clearly prefer her life to the child's life in that situation. So that's a very strong source that seems to imply that yes, the fetus is not, in a sense, a fully fledged human being from a halachic standpoint, from a legal standpoint. So to sum up, we have three sources in the Talmud. All right, if someone were to come and say, "Oh, I will look in the Talmud to see what the Talmud believes about life and the definition of life," then one would find sources that were contradictory. The first source, talking about Noahide, the Noahide legal system, discusses even fetuses as being human beings that one would be held responsible for killing as if he murdered a fully fledged human being. But source 2, the Tractate Nida, does not seem to imply that, but rather only once the baby is born. And source 3 certainly seems to imply that, because we prefer the life of the mother to the life of the fetus. Up to here, as I mentioned, is simply a review of the Gemaras, a review of what the Talmud has to say on this issue. And as you can see, we can equivocate, we can go either way on this issue. Okay, so that's part 1. But even though source 4, which I'm not going to read, it's the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, he lived in the 14th century, and the Ritva, who also lived in the 14th and 15th century, Rabbi Yom Tov Rabbi Avraham Alashpili, both of these, what we call Rishonim, that's the nickname that we give Jewish scholars from that time, even though they clearly state, okay, that yes, that a fetus is not a fully fledged human being from a legal halachic standpoint. The Rambam, the famous Maimonides, says something different. And here I turn you to source 6, okay? Maimonides, when he reflects upon that third source that I mentioned to you before, seems to take a different position. So I'm reading. It is a commandment not to care for the life of a rodef. So if someone is running after you to kill you, you do not have to allow them to finish the job, but rather you can save your own life in order to save your own, you can save your life, and by doing so, if by doing so means killing the other individual, you're allowed to do so. Lefikach, therefore, הורו חכמים שהעוברה שהיא מקשה לילד, מותר לחתוך העובר במאה, בין בסם, בין ביד, מפני שהוא כרודף אחריה להורגה. Therefore, the rabbis taught that a pregnant woman who is now in labor, we're allowed to cut out the fetus from inside of her, even if it kills the fetus, because he is like a rodef trying to kill her. And let's complete the statement in the Rambam. Ve'im mishotzi rosho. If once he takes out his head, ein nog'in bo, there we don't touch him. She'en dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh. Vezeu tiv'o shel olam. We don't put aside the life of the child for the life of the mother once he pokes his head out, because this is the natural occurrence. Maimonides' reading of the Gemara of the Talmud has led some halachic deciders to look at this entire thing differently. Because let's think about it for a second. What's Maimonides saying? He's saying, oh, here's the deal. When the child is the fetus, so he's a rodef. When the child comes out, when he pokes his head out, he's no longer considered a rodef, and then the mother and the child are on equal standing. So look what Maimonides says. He doesn't say, oh, the mother and child are on equal standing at that point because they're both human beings, but when the child is in the womb, then one of them is a fully fledged human being and one is not. That's not what he says. He doesn't say that. He could have said that, and then it would have explained everything, but he doesn't say that. He implies that even when the child is a fetus, they have the same status from a human perspective. They're both human beings. But when the child is in the womb, he is considered a rodef. He is considered someone who's trying to kill the mother, and therefore the mother can protect herself. But once he's poked his head out, then it's like fair game in a sense. So the fact that Maimonides couches this halacha in that sort of language implies that for him, the fetus and the mother are both fully fledged human beings, but in one case, the mother can save herself because it's a rodef situation, and the other, she cannot. So I sum up, okay, what we've seen so far. All right? And I know some of this is a little bit difficult. I've tried to simplify it as much as possible. But to sum up, the Talmud speaks in two voices on this issue, though in my personal opinion, I would say that it leans more towards saying that the fetus is not of an equal standing with the mother and with other human beings as well, obviously, and that's number one. Number two, the Rishonim, meaning scholars between the 11th and 15th century who dealt with this question, also speak in two different voices. Some of these scholars, like the Rashba and the Ritva, which I mentioned before but did not read, believe that indeed the child needs to be born to be a fully fledged human being. But from Maimonides, we can infer the opposite, that in fact, even a fetus has that status of a fully fledged human being, and therefore the mother the mother would not have been able to prefer her life to his, except for the fact that we term him a rodef, and that halachic status allows saving the mother's life rather than saving the child's life. All this stood before the poskim, the halachic deciders of the 20th century, when they came to discuss this issue. And a very significant machloket, meaning controversy, began between two very, very significant Talmudic minds. One of them lived in America, and you've probably heard his name. His name was Rav Moshe Feinberg, and he was a very, very great halachist, wrote many books, and very, very well respected. Let me stop the share for a second. Very well respected, very significant Talmudist. I don't think I need to tell you that. And the other one lived in Israel, perhaps less well known to you, the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg. He was also a very, very significant halachist, Talmudic scholar, and the two of them had a raging debate for many years on this issue. Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked regarding aborting a child who it is learned is suffering from Tay-Sachs. All right. Now, Tay-Sachs, I am assuming that you all know, is a horrible, horrible situation, a genetic reality that affects the child in a way that, to the best of my knowledge, except for, I think maybe there are really rare, but generally that means that the child will live a very, very painful life, and B, that life is terminal, meaning that it won't be, I don't think most babies live past 4 years old, but maybe things have changed today and I don't know. Either way, it's a terrible, terrible thing. And certainly when Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked about this, that was the reality. The reality was that as far as he knew, Tay-Sachs children would not survive. In other words, they would be born, they would live X amount of years, but they wouldn't live past the age of 4. And the life that they would have would be full of pain and suffering. They could be blind, they could be, intellectually deficient, lots of other things. It's just really, really horrible. And Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked, because abortions became more prevalent in America, he was asked whether or not it would be okay in this extreme case of a child with Tay-Sachs, whether it would be okay to do an abortion. Rav Moshe Feinstein was unequivocally opposed to abortions. He said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Even with a Tay-Sachs baby, he said, absolutely. He said that if he used very strong language, okay? He said that as far as he's concerned, if someone, aborts a child in that situation, as far as he's concerned, it's not mercy, it's murder, and it's not the right thing to do, and you can't do it, and we can't possibly allow such a thing. So he was a very, very vocal voice of opposition to abortions. And like I said, I brought a very extreme case to show how opposed he was, because, to say in less significant case, that's one thing. But even with Tay-Sachs, he was very insistent that it should be done, and that it should not be done. And I'll tell you that in the Talmud, I didn't bring the source, but in the Talmud, right, there is a distinction that is made between 40 days, like before 40 days and after 40 days. The Talmud says in one place that in the 40 days after initial inception, the child is what the Gemara calls maya be'alma. It's like water. In other words, he's not formed at all. And because he's not formed, there is reason to think that abortion at that stage would be more allowed. Rav Moshe Feinstein was not even willing to allow such a thing, not even within the first 40 days, where on the face of it, one could certainly make a very strong case that it would be okay, but Rav Moshe Feinstein would not hear it. Not only would he not hear it, he, even when sources from different scholars, Jewish scholars throughout the ages were presented to him that seemed to imply that there were options, he refuted them all. And he said, this one's a mistake, and that one is, like it's a misread of the manuscript. And he went into it, and he really, really pushed not to accept such a thing. I'm assuming, I can't know for sure, but I've heard this from other people as well, that part of this was political, meaning in the sense that Rav Moshe Feinstein felt, from his perspective, that he was fighting a trend. In other words, that he was fighting off what would become, from his perspective, like a pandemic of, people going and aborting in all kinds of situations. And so he had to stem the flood, so he had to be the one standing at the front gate, and saying, absolutely not, I'm drawing the line over here, and that's that. So that's Rav Moshe Feinstein's position. I would read it with you inside, but I don't want to waste any more time, and I see that we're running out of time. However, Rav Waldenberg, who I mentioned before, living here in Israel, in a different climate, and like I said over here, the conversation, doesn't really exist in a public fashion. Not that no one ever mentions it, but as I've once again mentioned to you before, anyone who's going to, do an abortion here usually will have to go through some sort of a committee, and that committee many times also has rabbinical figures, and they can, and people usually also ask. I have been asked as a rabbi, I have been asked about cases of abortion, like people come to me and ask whether it's okay or not okay, or this or that. So people usually, they try to get the best rabbinical advice that they can get, considering their situation. And it's not so much of a discussion. People just, they try to do the best that they can with the sense that they have and with the people that are around them. And that's that. It's not a public discussion. Rav Waldenberg, living here in that sort of situation, I think was less perturbed by the possibility. And he writes very clearly about a Tizak's pregnancy, that an abortion can be had. And he even says up to 7 months. He specifically writes, even up to 7 months. I don't know what he would have said beyond 7 months, but certainly up to 7 months, he says for sure that there's no problem and you can abort the fetus. And aborting the fetus is not tantamount to murder, and that actually it's a merciful act to do for the child in that situation. And that one should, take mercy and not bring a child into the world that is just going to suffer all of his days, cause suffering, maybe even to the parents and the people around him. And that's not a good thing to do. And therefore he allowed the abortion. In a subsequent responsum that he wrote, Rav Waldenberg also considered the possibility of a Down syndrome child. I think back then they used to call them something else, like a mongoloid, or they had like a different word for it. But nevertheless, child that was had Down syndrome. And today, I think we all know people with Down syndrome, or I do anyway. And they, thank God, very productive members of society and able to do a lot of things, get married and all kinds of other things. But back then, certainly things were a little bit less so when these responsa were written. And there also the family came up to the Rav Waldenberg and was very worried about their ability to raise and give a good life to a child with Down syndrome. And so they asked whether that was okay or not okay. Rav Waldenberg says that it's complicated. He doesn't say yes or no in that specific responsa. He says that it really depends. If it's a family that having this child will really affect them badly from a mental health perspective, from other perspectives, they really can't handle it. And the family and that it's a problem. So yes, there would be an ability to abort even in that situation. He doesn't mention a certain number of months and doesn't mention exact criteria. But if it's a family that can handle it, that is able, that has support, that can give support, then on the face of it, there's no reason to abort. And in that situation, they should have the child and not go through with the abortion. To be clear, Rav Moshe Feinstein, right? The two of them had, as you can see, a stark disagreement. Rav Moshe Feinstein relies heavily on Maimonides, on the Rambam, who I mentioned before, brings down Maimonides' opinion, discusses it, and proves from it that abortions are prohibited. And this, of course, harkens back to the Gemara, the first source in the Talmud that I mentioned before. While Rav Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, does the opposite. First of all, he re-explains Maimonides so that it doesn't contradict his understanding of the Halacha. He brings down those opinions that hold that an abortion is allowed. And of course, harkens back to the Talmudic sources that I mentioned before, sources 2 and 3, which seem to say that the status of a fetus is definitely different than the status of a fully fledged human being. I once had a question come to me about there was a child and they found that there was some sort of brain damage. I'm trying to remember the exact case, but it might have been genetic, but I don't remember exactly. There was some sort of brain damage that the doctors couldn't tell you exactly, like to what extent there was damage and what would be with the baby. But the mother was very reluctant to have the child, and so they asked me. I felt that it was above my pay grade to tell someone to abort or not abort. These are human lives that we're talking about. And unless you're absolutely certain you know what you're doing and that you know what you're ruling, I don't think that you should be necessarily dealing with these things. So I went to my Rebbe, Rabbi Rabinowitz, who was the head of a yeshiva, of a school in Israel, in Malad. And I asked him this question. I believe the fetus was about 3 months old, if I'm not mistaken. And my Rebbe, Rabinowitz, said that they can go through with the abortion and that it's fine. And if they don't, if they feel either that they are unprepared or that bringing such a child into the world would be painful for the child, for them, and accompanied by much suffering, that they don't have to go ahead with it, go through with it, and that rather they can go through with the abortion. So that's something that I also heard from my Rebbe. There is a posek here in Israel, Rav Moshe Sternbuch. He wrote several responsa on the issue. And for example, in some of them he's lenient and in some of them he's stringent, to be clear. But for example, in one of them, where the mental health of the mother was in danger, so if there was significant worry that the mother would commit suicide, take her own life if she wasn't able to abort the child, the Rav Sternbuch allowed the abortion and said that definitely that's like the case that the Gemara talks about, where you save the mother's life rather than the child's life, even though in the case that the Talmud is talking about, it's a physical issue, not a mental issue. But nevertheless, Rav Sternbuch felt that these cases were similar, could be equated, and therefore also ruled leniently. One last line, and then I'll open up for questions or comments. So you see here that the issue is, from a Jewish legal perspective, is fraught. It's not simple. It's not easy. And I remind again that from what everybody agrees is that you can't abort a fetus just for no reason. In other words, a fetus is definitely of significance. If it's not a fully fledged human being, it is definitely a human being, in potentia, and therefore should be treated as such. It's not a simple decision to make an abortion, but different halachists will obviously juggle the considerations and decide differently in different kinds of cases. I hope that that exposition helps to put certain things in perspective, and I'm opening up the floor to questions and comments. Should I be calling on people? Okay.
Please, please, you can just unmute yourself if you want to ask something.
Okay, I did it first. What you have here is still a bunch of men determining the basic functions of what happens to a woman. And frankly, it is none of their business. It is the most basic form of slavery to impose that decision by these men on a woman. It is up to her whether she carries that baby or aborts that baby. And it should be totally up to her, not a bunch of old men sitting and thinking they are making history. It is slavery to do otherwise.
I hear what you're saying. I understand. I understand your perspective. I agree with you that it's the woman's decision. I definitely agree with that.
Rabbi?
Back in the day when I was very active in abortion rights advocacy and studying it at the same time, we were trying to counteract bad legislation, et cetera, in Arizona. A subject came up as we were looking at different religions' perspective on abortion, and that subject was ensoulment. And I recall, although it was a long time ago, perhaps it had more to do with the Catholic religions and others. And the question was, when does the fetus have a soul? And if so, what are you doing when you terminate a pregnancy? And if it doesn't have a soul, I think back in the day, and again, it's so long ago, I can't remember, but in Catholic philosophy, that the male fetus had a soul sooner than the female fetus, and so you could abort a female fetus later than a male fetus, etc. But at any rate, it had to do with the soul. Is there any conversation about that in the Talmud or Halacha in general about ensoulment?
That sounds fascinating. I've never heard that. That sounds really, really interesting. I'm not going to say that there is no discussion of it, because you should never say that about Jewish books. There probably is somewhere, but there isn't, I would say, a proper halachic legal discussion that I'm aware of from that perspective. It probably is interconnected with the question of a soul, but it's never mentioned directly, as such. That's not a direct discussion that is being had. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Rabbi, outside of the scenario of a potential birth defect, and outside of the scenario of a woman who would suffer extreme mental health or suicidal ideation, what is the Jewish perspective on the situation of a woman who's pregnant and who does not want to be pregnant?
Once again, so I say again, first of all, you can't really say, I don't really feel comfortable saying Jewish perspective. I've just shown that there are very significant discussions that are being had between halachists about this, and that they don't always agree. So therefore, I think it would be wrong for me to call what the Jewish perspective is. However, as I said, a woman, right, who is seeking to know what the halacha has to say about the situation, I think that she would find that there is no, that generally, if she's pregnant, right, and there are no adverse effects to her giving birth, that she is not allowed to abort the child, because the child is a human being on some level, and therefore to do so would be to deny that child its life. So therefore she cannot do that. Once again, if there are no adverse effects. If there are adverse effects, and that usually is why people think about abortion, then of course, once again, in that situation, we need to understand what's going on. Of course, every posek, every rabbi will say differently about different situations.
Rabbi Rosensweig, it's a pleasure
Yes.
to see you. There are a couple of issues that are interesting. One is, of course, that we know what's going on in Texas and it's around the country, this move against Roe v. Wade. And I think one of the distinctions that people are feeling, and I heard it in Judith's frames, is that there is a distinction between the government outlawing it and an educational frame that might educate people who are really concerned about the moral questions, to educate them thoughtfully, sensitively, and wisely. And so the one question is the distinction between, like, in other words, I might claim that what you've demonstrated is that if a person comes with a tzitz Eliezer to Supreme Court and says, you're depriving me my right to practice my religion as I see fit, which includes the ability to do abortion, then a law outlawing abortion would actually be a violation of my civil rights. So that's one question, is that, does that make sense to you, that argument, that Jewish argument? And the other is, you didn't mention viability, and it seems to be a significant piece of the question in regard to the way American law is now addressing this question. Is viability, and does anyone raise within the poskim not a time frame of of months, but a question of viability, because viability probably before 7 months might be realistic?
Maybe just to be clear that I'm clear, viability meaning chances that the child will survive.
Meaning the child could survive outside the womb. In other words, if the fetus is utterly dependent on the mother, then one could claim that it doesn't have enough sufficient independent status. But once one can take a fetus that is inside a womb, take it out, and it can survive, then the metric of the head poking out feels like a late metric.
Right. So in other words, and then you're saying also that as technology advances, the bar would, the goalpost would move.
The goalpost could move, and then one could claim that a different moral education for women, for their families, for the rabbis that they seek, advice on, would shift. I'm still thinking the law could not prohibit, but the ethic in the community could be articulated thoughtfully.
Right. Look, I definitely agree with you, Rabbi Greenberg. And I when I said before that I agree with Judith, I meant it. What was I saying? I was saying that as you and I know, and anyone who practices halacha knows, the system that we go by is very much a personal one. In other words, in the sense that we don't legislate these things on a national level. We legislate them on a personal level. So therefore, rabbis don't go house to house forcing women to either abort or not abort. A woman should decide whether she wants to seek rabbinic counsel. And if she does want to seek rabbinic counsel, then the rabbi, according to her request and by her desire and want, should get involved and help her make the best decision according to her system of beliefs. So therefore, obviously, I don't believe that we should be forcing anyone to do anything. I believe that women who, once again, seek to live an Orthodox lifestyle and want to go by a certain Orthodox creed should seek out those individuals that she feels can direct her in that way. And so if we're talking about the government getting involved, I'm not a big fan. Yeah, so, people, can obviously, countries need laws and this and that, but, and I know a little bit about what's going on in America right now, but I prefer, from a religious perspective, simply, that every woman should have the right to make her own decision about what she wants to do and who she asks and who she seeks wisdom from and direction from. So, that would be, I think, probably the best way from that perspective. And in terms of the criteria that you're talking about, interesting. I don't think that I've seen in the poskim those discussions about viability. So I don't think that I've seen that anywhere, nor have I heard it. But it's an interesting perspective. It's worth thinking about. I really don't know. I don't think I've seen it.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
What happens in Israel? Is there a procedure to go through, or a woman just goes to her doctor and they decide?
In Israel, there is as far as I know, there's a committee that you have to go through, but I don't remember hearing any I don't remember hearing any horror stories. In other words, that people go to a committee and the committee says no or something, like, even though they really want to. I never heard any stories like that. Usually, as I said, most cases anyway are probably justified on some level. So, as far as I know, hospitals have committees, and you go through the committee, and then you can do the abortion. That's my generally. Like, I know I'm not 100% sure, but that's what I know.
Thank you.
I see.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Just as a comment, it's very interesting to me that that these very old texts talk about 40 days, because it's at about 6 weeks of fetal life or embryonic life that you can first detect a fetal heart rate.
Wow.
So I think it's fascinating that 40 days was set as a criteria so long ago, when we obviously didn't have those kinds of technologies. And just as a matter of information, fetal viability is probably down to about 24 weeks. Many of these kids have horrific problems when they're born that prematurely, but it has continued to become less and less time. I'm a retired pediatrician, so compared to when I trained, where even 28 weeks was pushing it, 30 weeks maybe. And now some of these children born prematurely can survive at 24 weeks with an enormous amount of intensive care. And again, many of them with significant neurologic, lifelong neurologic compromise, but not all. So it's interesting. And I fully agree with Judith, and certainly with the late great Chief Justice Ginsburg, who said, a woman's body is a woman's body. Get the government out of here, basically. Thank you for your talk. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
In order to be helpful for the American discourse, I just want to just push this one more step with you, Rabbi. Let's imagine that we're putting our head into the portion of the United States that is willing to sacrifice many other achievements for the sake of this abortion question. And I want to understand from their point, because if we simply fight this battle as we're the good and they're the evil, I don't think we're going to communicate well. So I guess my question is this: is there some frame? I mean, look, just because an issue seems kind of clear on one side, it is a woman's body, I think that everyone would be horrified if if a person actively attempted to kill a fetus in the 8th month. I think that for no reason. In other words, it wouldn't seem so challenging to imagine that at some juncture, our opponents are claiming that life is sufficiently human to make this just wrong. It's probably not murder, but it might be something akin to murder, because you wait a month and the child is out and it's already would be survivable outside the womb. So I'm trying to grasp, if we could, do our halachic resources provide a modulation that is not only about the mother, but about the deep theological questions about life itself that are being raised by our opponents?
I don't know. You're putting me on the spot with a quite a deep question, I have to say. So it's hard for me to be able to answer it with any sort of clear direction. The legal questions are obviously technical in nature. With regards, so that's why at the beginning of the talk I said, regards to life itself, life is sacred. Judaism has always viewed life as sacred. I can quote sources from here till tomorrow, and all of them, so I don't have to. And therefore, and this is someone else asked here, can you abort for no reason? And indeed, I don't think you should abort for no reason, at all. And we have to take seriously, the fact that whatever the status is, a fetus is not just nothing, right? It's something, obviously. So yes, that definitely is like a standing staple, but without a, I do not think, to answer your question, that as far as I know, that Judaism has, or Jewish scholars, I should say, the Jewish scholars have dwelt on this topic in a way that is spiritually inspiring and edifying, to the extent that you could use it to come to the American public or to the Jewish American public, even less so, to really come and give like what I would call a Mishnah Dura. In other words, that you have like a well thought out, position on this. I don't know of any writing that has been done, to really flesh this out. So what you're asking is a very deep question in my eyes, and worthwhile of research and to write something. But I don't think that work has ever been done.
Not done.
As far as I know. But maybe Rav Shmuley has what to add to that. I don't know. Maybe.
I'm not going to add on to that at the moment, just given the time. But I do want to thank you for this deep presentation, and everyone for their participation on this sensitive and crucial topic. So thank you. And we know it's already midnight in Israel, so we thank you for staying up with us, although you would be up anyways, as you said. Friends, we hope you'll join us with Rabbi Aryeh Cohen next Wednesday on Beyond Caging, Restorative Justice and Rethinking Safety. Also, my debate class on Tuesday. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.